I never thought I'd live to see the day when my own flesh and blood would look me in the eye and say, "Dad, maybe it's time you moved out. You're just in the way now." I raised that girl with everything I had. I worked my fingers to the bone, built a home brick by brick, and sacrificed every comfort so she could grow up safe, warm, and loved. And now? Now she wanted me gone, as if I was nothing more than an old burden, clutter to be swept out of sight. But she made one mistake. She thought the house we lived in, my house, was hers to inherit, hers to claim, hers to push me out of. She had no idea the storm she had just unleashed. Because if she wanted me out of her life, fine. But she was about to lose far more than she ever imagined. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about an old man who refused to be thrown away like garbage. And if you're patient enough to listen, I'll tell you how I turned her little scheme upside down, and how the house she thought would be hers disappeared right from under her nose. I wasn't born with much, and I never asked life for more than a roof, a meal, and a family to share it with. When I was young, I worked with my hands, carpentry, odd jobs, long hours. Money was always tight, but I carried pride in the fact that what little we had was earned honestly. Then, when my daughter was born, everything changed. I remember holding her for the first time, so small, so fragile, her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, and in that moment I made a silent promise she would never go without. Life wasn't easy. My wife struggled with her health, and soon the responsibility of our household fell mostly on my shoulders. I cooked, I cleaned, I fixed what broke, and when she passed far too early, I became both father and mother overnight. Those first years of being a single dad were brutal. I worked during the day, sometimes until midnight, and came home to make sure homework was done, that dinner was warm, that she felt safe. I'd fall asleep in the old chair by the window, only to wake up before dawn and do it all over again. My body ached, but my heart stayed strong because I wasn't living for myself. I was living for her. Every dollar I earned went straight into her future. When she needed braces, I picked up weekend shifts. When she wanted piano lessons, I sold my fishing gear. I remember winters when the house was cold because I couldn't afford enough firewood. I gave her my blanket and sat shivering in my jacket, telling her I wasn't cold. She was too young to know better. But there were joys too, small moments that made it all worthwhile. Her laughter echoing through the house as she ran down the hallway, her little drawings taped on the fridge, some of them of me with a big smile, hammer in hand, birthdays where the cake was small, but her eyes lit up as if it was a feast fit for royalty. When she cried about missing her mother, I held her close. Osen whispered, "Daddy's here, always." And I meant it, always. Years passed, and she grew into a bright, ambitious young woman. College was expensive, but I found a way. I took loans. I sold tools I'd used for decades. I even postponed fixing my own teeth because her tuition mattered more than my smile. I remember packing her bags when she left for university. I cried that night, sitting in her empty room, staring at the posters still hanging on the walls. But my heart swelled with pride. She was chasing dreams I never had the chance to chase. While she was away, I kept the house standing. This house wasn't just wood and nails. It was my fortress, my labor of love. Every squeaky floorboard had a story. Every nail hammered into place was a piece of my life. I patched leaks, mended fences, replaced shingles one by one, even when my back screamed with pain. Why? Because I wanted her to return to a home that felt safe, steady, eternal. And when she came back after graduation, bringing her husband with her, I welcomed them both with open arms. I thought, this is it. My family is whole again. I gave them the best rooms, the warmest part of the house. I even built a little playhouse in the yard for the grandchildren I hoped would come one day. My life was simple. I ate little, wore the same old boots, and never traveled farther than the town limits. But none of that mattered. What mattered was family. What mattered was giving them everything I could. And yet, Even in those moments of quiet joy, there was loneliness. Nights when the house was dark and empty, when I'd sit by myself with only the ticking clock for company. I often wish my wife could have seen our daughter grow, could have shared the burden with me. Still, I never complained. I bore it all with pride, because that's what fathers do. We carry the weight so our children can walk freely. I never thought, never in my darkest hours, that the very child I gave my life to would one day turn her back on me. But I suppose life has a cruel way of teaching us lessons we never asked for. It began with small things, almost invisible at first. A joke at dinner that landed like a stone in my chest. "Dad, you're always so sentimental," she said, laughing too loud. Her husband chuckled and added, "He gets attached to things, old habits." I smiled and kept my fork moving, trying to make it light. But something in the way they said it felt cold, practiced. That night I lay awake, wondering if I'd heard it wrong. The next week, she stopped asking about my day. She started scheduling things without telling me. She began referring to our future plans in a tone that left no room for me. I remember the first time I felt truly stunned. I came home from a long day to find a pamphlet laid on my pillow. It was glossy, with photos of bright rooms and smiling nurses. On the cover, in bold letters, "Assisted living options." My hands went numb. I called her immediately. "Why is this on my bed?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Oh, that," she said. "I found it in the mail. Thought you might want to look." "Who put it there?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "It was probably me. You know, just looking out for you. Looking out for me." The words tasted like poison. Shock is odd. It's like your brain lags behind your heart. I felt distant, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold on a stage. Then the whispers started. Neighbors I'd known for years would look at me with quick pity and lowered voices. "Have you thought about somewhere smaller?" they'd ask, as if my home was already a problem. Once at a family barbecue, she pointed to a corner of the yard and said, loud enough for everyone, "We could put an extension here, but it would be easier if Dad moved out." Laughter bubbled around her like champagne. My mouth went dry. I hadn't realized the humiliation could be so public. I tried to laugh it off, but the sting lingered. Then came the comments from her husband. Small, strategic knives. "This place has potential," he said to me, all smiles. "Imagine what we could do with the layout if only—" "If only what?" I asked. He smiled like a man who already owned a secret. "If only it were empty," he said lightly. I remember sitting on the porch that night, the world sharp and unreal. Shock gave way to a heavy, aching sadness. I began to replay years of sacrifice in my head, late nights, extra shifts, missed birthdays, like a movie that mocked me. How could the person I had sheltered and fought for be talking about my life like it was disposable? I confronted her in the kitchen once, in a moment of fragile courage. "Why would you say things like that about me?" I asked, voice shaking. She looked at me with an impatient sigh. "Dad, don't be dramatic. We're planning for the future." "Because you think I'm a burden?" I whispered. She folded her arms. "Not a burden, an obstacle." The word hit harder than any blow. Disbelief set in like fog. I could not accept that she would label me an obstacle, my own child. I went to bed that night with my hands clenched under the blanket. Days passed, and the small cuts became gashes. I found out she had been talking to her siblings, my other relatives, about the property. She spoke as if the house were already a currency to be apportioned. "She's been talking about the layout, the resale value," an aunt told me, trying to soften it. "You should talk to her," the aunt said, eyes flicking away. "Talk to her? About what? About being kicked out of my own home?" The humiliation was like sand in my mouth. Then came the measuring. One afternoon I returned from the hardware store to find a man with a clipboard measuring the... Holly looked up, startled. "Oh, I thought this was vacant for a showing. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it. She was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, perfectly composed. "Dad," she said, voice like a script, "we're just checking possibilities." "You brought strangers into my house?" I asked. "We're exploring options," she repeated. There is a stunned, hollow kind of disbelief when a loved one violates your home. I felt as if someone had reached into my chest and rearranged organs. At family dinner, she announced plans without asking. "We're thinking of modernizing the kitchen," she said brightly. "Wouldn't it be amazing?" Her husband talked about removing my old workbench to make space. My workbench. The thing I'd used to build the very cabinets they wanted to modernize. I tried to explain, to make them understand what that bench meant. Years of labor, memories, the grooves where my hammer had landed. She listened like a person humoring a quaint tale. "Dad, you're sentimental," she said again. Shame washed over me, hot and bitter. The children, my grandchildren, started being encouraged to play in other rooms. "One side is dusty," she'd say. "Let's keep them away." It felt like being erased from my own family's map. I remember the night I walked into the living room and found a stack of glossy renovation brochures on the coffee table. My handwriting was not on the sign-up sheets. On the top brochure, someone had circled an estimated profit margin, numbers cherry-picked and smug. Their greed wasn't even hidden, it was advertised. There was a conversation I overheard by accident that broke me. I was fixing a loose stare when her husband called her in the other room. "Can we speed things up?" he asked. "We'll have to be careful with Dad," she said. "But yes, if we time it around his doctor's visit, we can push him to consider a home." They talked about timing me like a nuisance to be scheduled. They spoke about liquidating the asset and a quick flip. I felt my stomach drop into an abyss. My hands, which had always built and mended, led with something else now. Betrayal. I had always believed love was a fortress. I never imagined it could be a scheme. One evening, when I confronted her again, she looked at me like I was an awkward interruption. "Dad, you're making this about drama," she said, precise and controlled. "How can you say that to me?" I asked. She shrugged. "We're adults. We have to make smart financial choices." "Smart for who?" I asked, and my voice rose. "For the family," she shot back. "For our future." She said "our," as if I had been erased from that pronoun. That word, "our," cut me to the bone. I began to feel anger bubbling under the numbness. It came slowly at first, a heat in my chest. Then it grew, like a coal fed with breath. I caught her on the phone with a lawyer, brief, hushed, efficient. "We'll need to discuss the title," she said. "Can we move forward if he resists?" Resists, as if I were some stubborn piece of furniture to be shifted. My disbelief turned into a cold, simmering rage. There was a day when friends looked at me with sorrow and asked, "Are you okay?" I wanted to scream, "Do you not see what she's doing?" Instead, I smiled thinly and said, "I'm fine." But I was anything but fine. Humiliation had a weight. It bent me forward, bowed my shoulders in public. At a neighborhood meeting, she publicly argued for community upgrades and implied the old house was an eyesore. People nodded politely, and I felt so small. I remember the way my daughter said, "It's for the best," like a benediction, while I sat there trying to breathe. That night I sat at my kitchen table, hands folded over the pamphlet still in my drawer, and I counted the ways they had taken what was mine. They had taken my voice. They had taken my place. They had treated my life's work like a check to be cashed. And worst of all, they had treated me like a problem to be solved. Sadness came first, deep, acid, like a hollow that swallowed my appetite for everything else. Then disbelief that someone I loved could stratify me into an inconvenient elder. Finally, anger arrived, hot, justified, and absolute. I could feel it settling into my bones, steadying me. By the time I saw the real estate flyer posted to the community board with a photo of my house and metrics about high buyer interest, I no longer felt stunned. I felt violated, and my anger was a furnace waiting to be stoked. I thought of every night I had stayed up to make sure she was warm, every shift I took to pay for her schooling. How dare they speak of liquidating the asset while calling it our future? I sat there with the flyer shaking in my hands, and the embers of revenge, quiet and patient, started to glow. The humiliation had burned me, but it had not broken me. It had fueled something else, a determination to reclaim what was mine in a way they would never forget. The day it finally snapped was ordinary in every way, cruel in the way ordinary things often are when fate is about to deal a hand. I woke to rain against the window and the low, familiar creak of the house settling. My bones felt heavier than usual, but I told myself it was just age. I shuffled to the kitchen and made coffee the way I always have, strong, black, single-cup ritual that steadied the morning. The radio murmured about traffic. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Life carried on, oblivious. Then I noticed the envelope on the mat by the front door. It was thick, professional-looking, the kind of paper you see when someone is making final plans without you. My hands tightened before I even opened it. A small animal fear crawled down my spine. Inside was a polite letter, clinical, cold, inviting me to discuss moving options and healthcare transitions. There was a signature. There was a stamped appointment for a consultation during the week my daughter said she'd be home. For a second, my chest just emptied, like someone had pulled a plug. I sat down hard at the kitchen table, coffee forgotten and cooling. My mind grabbed. Bed at memories. The miles I walked to save for her. The nights I spent lying awake listening for her breathing. The summers I worked overtime while she learned to play the piano. Each memory arrived like a photograph. Color faded, but real. Grief washed through me first, a cold, familiar tide. I thought of her mother, of what she would say if she could see us now. Don't be weak, I imagined our old life saying. Stand up for what's yours. But grief is sneaky. It makes you small at first. I felt small. I felt foolish for thinking love was protection. I remembered the pamphlet on my bed, the measuring man in my hallway, the realtor's glossy flyer pinned to the community board. Each of those moments stitched together into a sickening pattern I could no longer deny. My hands that had once cradled her as a newborn, trembled with something beyond sorrow. Anger smoldered, but it was a quiet thing then, like coals hidden under ashes. I found myself walking through the house, touching the walls, as if they were people. My thumb traced the groove near the mantel, where the mantel clock used to sit. My palm pressed the spot on the workbench, where an old nail had left a scar. I let the memories speak. The scraped knees I bandaged, the spelling tests I helped study for until my eyes blurred, the nights I had sat in emergency rooms waiting and praying. How many times had I swallowed pride so she could have more? How many times had I put her needs before my own aches and wants? Each answer hardened something inside me. I thought of the neighbors, who now nodded with pity, the way my daughter casually called me an obstacle, as if I were a roadblock sign to be removed. There was humiliation, yes, the worst kind, the one that comes when your child reduces your life to an inconvenience. But under that humiliation, a deeper, more dangerous current began to run, a sense of betrayal, ayal, that felt like the snapping of a treasured rope. My grief informed me. My memory fed the fuel. I was no longer only hurt. I was calculating. What good is staying here if they treat me like a shadow? I asked myself out loud to the empty kitchen. A laugh escaped me, harsh, surprised. You built this house, I told the empty room. You put every stone in place. The rain grew harder against the glass, and the sound matched the drumbeat that had begun in my chest. I thought of leaving quietly, of packing my few things and letting them have the house, but the thought turned my stomach. No, that would be surrender dressed as kindness, and I was tired of being kind to people who repaid me with indifference. I pictured the daughter who had once clung to my finger, who had whispered, "Don't go," when I left for night shifts, and now she was the one who wanted me gone. Disbelief slid away like a skin. Clarity took its place. The fog lifted, and the path ahead appeared, narrow but visible. I paced the floorboards until my feet ached, each step a metronome for the thought that had been circling my skull for weeks. Enough. Enough of being polite. Enough of pretending the whispers didn't reach me. Enough of being the sentimental old man, to be managed and scheduled. My internal monologue shifted from pleading to planning. I catalogued every slight, every public joke, every whispered conversation about liquidating assets. I remembered the man with the clipboard measuring my haul, and the way my daughter had so easily shrugged away my outrage. I felt the hurt hand me a map, the places where they had shown their true faces and the moments they had revealed their hunger. What would you do if someone took your tools? I asked myself, thinking of my bench, my hammers, the things that bore my fingerprints. I pictured packing those tools lovingly, one by one, and not returning them. I pictured handing over the deed on my own terms. Then, as if some switch had been turned, the grief that had clouded me for days coalesced into a fierce, bright determination. I would not be erased. I would not go quietly. I would make sure they felt the remove, not to ruin them, but to teach them what they had refused to learn about gratitude and respect. I closed my eyes and saw her face in countless past moments. Bedtime stories, where she'd fallen asleep mid-sentence, the first wobbly step she'd taken across my living room, her valedictory speech, where I'd sat, chest overflowing with pride. "How could you?" I whispered into my own palms. "How could you do this to someone who gave you everything?" Silence answered. And then resolve. I thought of the nights I'd been too tired for anger. Nights I'd swallowed pride for love. Those nights belonged to the past. Now, I owed myself a night of justice. The thought did not feel sinful. It felt necessary. It felt like setting a wrong thing right with my own two hands. I stood up straighter than I had in months, as if unspooling an invisible tether that had kept me small. My breathing evened. The weight in my chest changed. Grief remained, but it no longer controlled me. Determination did. I made myself a promise then, standing in the circle of my own life's work. I would not be shuffled aside. I would not be made into a problem to be scheduled. If they wanted the house, they would have to take it through me or through a reckoning of their own making. I pictured the smile I would wear when the truth came out and they realized the cost of their coldness. Not a cruel smile, but the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been forced to defend the legacy of his life. My hands found the ledger box where the deeds were kept, fingers tracing the edges of paper that bore my name in careful ink. I felt a fierce protectiveness for that name, for the life it represented. "No more," I told the silence, voice low and steady. "No more being shuffled away like an old chair. No more whispers. No more we. From now on, it will be my terms." The thunder rolled outside as if in agreement. The house seemed to lean in, listening. I sat down, took a pen, and began drafting the first of many decisions I would make. Each line I wrote steadied me. Each sentence made the path clearer. Each plan was a stitch repairing the tear they had made. Grief had taught me tenderness. Anger had taught me boundaries. Determination taught me to act. When I finally folded the paper and placed it in the drawer, my hands were steady. I felt the old man in me, but tempered, not broken, not beaten, not invisible. I rose, walked to the window, and looked out at the road leading from our drive. The trees bowed in the wind. The world had not changed. I had. And with that change came a vow. I would not be forgotten. I would not be a footnote in the story of my own life. I whispered to the night, to the house, to the memory of my wife, and the little girl who once clung to my finger. Enough is enough. I will not be pushed out. I will make them see what they tried to take. It was not a promise of malice. It was a promise of consequence. I would take back my dignity, piece by piece, and I would make sure that when the dust settled, they knew the cost of betrayal. And with that vow, the man who had been patient for years was gone, replaced by someone quieter, colder, and resolute, a man ready to do what he must to reclaim what was rightfully his. I did not storm into revenge like a man possessed. Revenge, I learned, is an apprenticeship, slow, steady, requiring patience. The first thing I did was breathe. I sat in my favorite chair and allowed the anger to cool into something useful. Focus. I made a list the old-fashioned way, with a stubby pencil and a grocery pad. Line by line, I wrote what I could control and what I could not. Control, the deed, my name on paper, conversations I had on record. Not control, their words, their plans, their shallow smiles. Then I called someone I trusted, a man named Frank, who had been a foreman 50 years ago and later became a small-time investor. Frank, I said, keeping my voice steady, I might need help with the house. There was a pause. You mean sell? He asked. Maybe, I said. Maybe on my terms. We met over coffee in a place with old linoleum and cheap, thick mugs, a place where secrets stayed warm. I told him the truth, but not everything. Don't let them know you're eager, Frank warned. If they suspect, they'll move quicker. So I played the part of the bewildered old man. I smiled when she suggested retirement homes. I agreed to doctor visits. I tucked the pamphlet where she had found it and pretended to read it. At night I walked to the tiny safe in my closet where the deed lived, and I touched the leather cover like a talisman. I reread the deed until the names blurred. My name, my ink. I counted the letters like prayers. Next, I visited a notary under a pretext about updating contact information. The clerk asked questions I answered in short, polite sentences. No alarms, no drama. I then quietly scheduled a meeting with a lawyer I knew, a man who used to help locals with wills, never flashy, always discreet. You sure you want to go this route? The lawyer asked, lifting his glasses. I'm tired of being treated as an object, I said. I want the outcome to come from me, not them. He nodded as if he understood more than I said. He drew up papers with the kind of care my hands used to give to dovetail joints. But the legalities were only half the plan. I had to keep appearances. I practiced looking frail in front of them. I let them think I was wavering. When my daughter praised the idea of renovations, I nodded like a man who had lost his voice. When they scheduled a consultation with a real estate agent, I pretended not to notice. Meanwhile, Frank and I whispered over numbers and timelines in his cluttered office. He rattled on the figures and told me what the house might fetch. He even spoke of quick buyers and developers with hungry eyes. Not them, I said. It can't be them. Frank smiled, thin and approving. I know a buyer who respects the old bones of a house. He'll keep it standing. He'll pay fair. We made sure everything would be lawful, tidy, unquestionable. I arranged for the title company to do its checks quietly, under the pretense of refinancing, a mundane phrase that aroused no suspicion. Each phone call was a stitch, each visit a nail driven slow and deep. At home, I planted tiny seeds of doubt in my daughter's mind. Not lies, but small reminders that the house was mine, that I knew its worth. Remember the west-facing window in the kitchen? I'd say casually as she walked by. You used to press your face there and watch storms. She'd smile, not thinking, then move on. I kept a ledger of conversations, not to expose them, but to remind myself where the lines were drawn. June 4th. Spoke with Realtor at 10 a.m. I wrote to enforce the rhythm of my plan. Patience was my currency. I did not rush Frank or the lawyer. We timed things for maximum effect, when they felt secure and entitled. I also found a quiet ally in my neighbor, Mrs. Klein, a widow with a memory like a steel trap. She had noticed more than anyone. The measuring, the glossy flyers, the way my daughter's laughter had become practiced. "If you want help," she said softly, pressing a plate of cookies into my hands, "I'll be there. I've seen this sort of thing before." Her eyes glinted with the kind of loyalty that holds a town together. Small moves built the scaffold, a signed power of attorney tucked away, a bank meeting confirmed, a transfer route plan that would be clean and above board. But I did not reveal the climax. Not yet. I wanted whispers, not shouts. Suspense, not surrender. At night I would sit at my workbench and rehearse conversations I might have with my daughter. I imagined her voice trembling. I imagined the husband's smugness cracking. I imagined the exact moment the truth landed and the air changed. I kept certain pieces of the plan hidden even from Frank. Some things a man must carry alone. There were practicalities that required discretion. The timing of the house inspection, the silent coordination with the title company, the transfer of keys at a moment when my daughter believed herself triumphant. I practiced patience like prayer. I watched and waited while they grew more careless. They threw themselves into plans for renovations, imagined their lives in rooms with my name on them. They painted dreams in a house that, on paper, still belonged to me. I let them think victory was near. I fed them enough to make their certainty fat and slow. Meanwhile, I set aside a small fund, money from a savings I'd never mentioned, to ensure there would be no hiccups that greedy people could exploit later. I prepared a small, respectable place near the lake, a hiding place for my things and my peace, so my departure could look like weakness even as it was control. Each ally I recruited was chosen for discretion. Frank the steady, the lawyer who liked neat files, Mrs. Klein with her watchful eyes. We built a quiet chain of custody for the deed so there would be no messy disputes. But I never allowed anyone to know the last line of my plan. I revealed pieces. The deed was in order, the buyer lined up, the title checked, but not the moment of exchange. When my daughter bragged about taking over the house at dinner with friends, I smiled and poured the wine, letting her imagine the future. Inside, I was putting the final gears into motion. I called the title company one Thursday afternoon and set a closing date for a week from then. A date that happened to coincide with a family celebration my daughter had foolishly scheduled. A small, cruel arithmetic, arranged by an old man who remembered how to count more than money. On the night before closing, I wrote a note to my lawyer, precise and succinct. Close on Friday. Transfer to Frank's trust. No early disclosures. Then I slept. One of the calmest sleeps I had had in months. By then the plan was less a scheme and more an inevitability, patient and immovable. But even as the legal wheels turned, I kept laying little traps of truth, a stray document left where she might see it, a casual mention of my meeting with Frank, a question that set her mind racing. I wanted her to feel the slow tightening of a noose of consequence, not for cruelty, but so she could taste the cost of what she had tried to do. Because revenge, in my hands, was not about ruin. It was about lesson. It was about the restoration of dignity. I let them grow bold. I let them plan their remodels and pick finishes while I signed papers they never thought to ask about. When people whispered about liquidating assets at the community center, I nodded and said nothing. I let their own voices be the soundtrack to my work. In the quiet hours, when errands were done and the house hummed with emptiness, I would sit with the deed and allow a small smile to come. Not pleasure at their pain, but a steady satisfaction that the life I'd built was again mine to decide. And still, I kept a secret tucked close. A final move I hadn't told a soul, not even Frank, because some consequences I wanted to deliver myself. What that final move would be exactly, I refused to say out loud, and that is why my plan kept its teeth. People often ask why I didn't confront them earlier. They cannot see how much power there is in silence. I let the plan breathe, expand, and then snapped shut like a trapdoor, on my timing, with my terms. So when the day of the transfer finally arrived, I was calm, hands steady, vision clear. But the last piece, the piece that would make them understand everything, remained folded in my pocket, waiting for the perfect moment to be unfolded. And as I walked through the rooms I had made with my hands, listening to the house's small sounds, I whispered to myself, they think I know the ending. Let them wait a little longer. Let their certainty rot. Then, when the world least expected it, I would turn the page. When the day came, I moved with a calm that surprised even me. I dressed neatly, buttoned the shirt my daughter used to like, and walked out like a man who owned nothing to apologize for. I met Frank at the title office while my daughter was busy rehearsing the victory speech she thought she'd give at family dinner. Frank's hand was steady as he slid the final packet across the table. "Everything's in order," he said. His voice was the sound of old wood finding its grain again. I signed with a hand that no longer trembled from shame, only with the certainty of someone who knows what he has to do. They had planned a celebration that night, a little party to mark the new beginning. They invited friends, they invited relatives. They set a table for a triumph that belonged to them in imagination only. I told nobody I was going to the closing. I told nobody I'd arranged things the way I had. Instead, I let their hubris do the rest of the work for me. The first twist came when the transfer registered on the title company's system earlier than they expected. Their smug texts arrived in my inbox like clockwork. "Dad's getting out of the way," one said. "Soon we'll have full control." I read each one in the quiet of a bench in the park, the late sun on my face, and felt nothing but the hollow satisfaction of inevitability. That night I arrived at the house under the pretense of bringing a dessert. They all laughed. "You're still the best cook," my daughter said. She didn't notice the little envelope in my pocket. She didn't see the way I watched her move around my kitchen as if measuring the air itself. After dinner, when the candles were low and the guests had poured out like a tide, I asked to speak alone with her. Her face was flushed, with success. Her husband hovered by the mantel, already unfolding plans in his mind. I handed her the envelope and sat back, pretending to be tired. Inside the envelope was nothing but a single plain sentence typed in my shaky, careful hand. "The house is sold." Her laugh came first, a high, incredulous sound. "What do you mean sold?" she said, speech making a stumble. I watched the color leave her face the way winter takes color from a map. "Check the registry tomorrow," I said. "You'll find my signature." She pounded the table in a way I had not seen since she was small, and anger translated into sobs. "This is illegal," her husband shouted, more petulant than frightened. "No," I said. "It's legal. It's mine." While they scrambled, the second twist began to unwind. The buyer was not a developer with plans to rip the house apart. Frank's buyer was a preservation trust, a man who had loved old houses his entire life and who respected history more than profit. He had agreed to one condition that fit me perfectly. The house must be preserved, unchanged externally, and never be used as a quick flip. It would stand, not as their playground, not as their renovation project, but as a living memorial to the life built within its walls. When I told them this, their faces froze. They had imagined luxury kitchens and new floors and a marketable, open plan. Instead, I had sold them a future of locked permits and covenants they could not break. They reacted with anger, then panic. But panic is a poor defense against paper and stamps. That was only the beginning. I had also left them a trail of truth. In the weeks before the sale, I'd kept copies of messages, casual boasts from the husband about flipping the property, the daughter's laughter marking plans to speed things up. I placed a few carefully chosen copies where they would be found, a printed email left on the coffee table, a screenshot with a message from her husband tucked into his coat pocket. They were not stolen. They were reminders of their own words. At dinner, When her brother-in-law found the printout and waved it with a drunken scoff, the room went cold. "You were talking about a flip," he read aloud, voice small all of a sudden. The friends who had cheered them now shifted, uncertain how to celebrate someone accused by their own evidence of greed. A neighbor I'd once waved to in passing, Mrs. Kleinson, stood and, with a trembling voice, recited what she had heard. The measuring, the realtor visits, the whispered plans. That small public chorus started a ripple I had not expected, but quietly hoped for. They tried to recover by saying they were only thinking ahead. But public opinion is a strange thing. It has a way of letting small betrayals become visible wounds. Then came a twist I had not counted on. The husband, in panic, made a mistake. He reached for the ledger I'd left out, the ledger of conversations and dates I'd kept like talismans, and in his haste he left fingerprints where he could not deny them. Within a day, a call came from his employer's office asking questions that could not be answered with charm. I had not sought to ruin his job, but his panicked scramble to cover tracks revealed other corners of his life that were less than honest. Rumors are a risky soil. They bloom quickly when water is applied in a panic. By morning, 2 people who had been their staunchest supporters had withdrawn invitations and made soft excuses about timing. I watched as the comfortable bubble around their dreams deflated into awkwardness and piling silence. They lashed out. My daughter called me cruel, ungrateful, and worse. She accused me of being petty, of stealing their future. When she screamed the word selfish at me, I felt the iron of the years I had put into her life sharpen into clarity. "You call me selfish?" I said, voice quiet but steady. "You who counted my life as an asset?" She faltered, not because I had the law on my side now, but because a mirror had been held up and she did not like what she saw. The third twist was the one that satisfied something older in me, the community hearing. Neighbors, curious and concerned, called a small meeting to talk about what they'd seen, not to vilify, but to ask for clarity. Frank attended, and so did the preservationist who had bought the house. He explained the covenant with a patience that made the room listen. When he spoke of preserving craftsmanship, of respecting a life's work, people who'd once admired my daughter's ambition now understood the other side of the coin. The husband's tone, once confident and smooth, broke into stuttering explanations about plans and opportunities. He had no defense against the slow legal iron of the documents I'd signed, and he had no allies left in the room. My daughter stood silent for a time, the weight of witnesses pressing in. That silence did what shouts could not. It allowed understanding to seep in. One of the guests, a young woman who once babysat my grandchildren, pulled me aside and said with tears, "You always did right by us. I'm sorry they forgot." Her words were a stitch. They were a reminder that, despite their betrayal, there were still people who remembered the man behind the walls. As for punishment, it came in forms that courts can measure and in social currencies people feel. Their plans were stalled by covenants I had arranged. Their reputation in the neighborhood soured. The husband's rash actions cost him an important contract at work. The daughter lost the illusion of entitlement she had wrapped herself in. But perhaps the sharpest punishment was the slow, private one, the look on my granddaughter's face when she asked me, "Why, Grandpa?" and the look on my daughter's face when she realized what she'd done to the family she claimed to protect. It is one thing to lose a house. It is another to see how you have treated a life inside it. There were more small surprises. The preservationist offered me a small stipend to record the history of the house. Stories of how we'd built the porch, the recipes we had cooked, the patch of garden where my daughter had first learned to plant beans. He wanted the spirit preserved, and I found myself telling stories I'd never meant to tell aloud. Everything from the night I fixed the roof in a storm to the way my wife used to hum over the stove. Those recordings became a kind of public testament to what the house had been, and suddenly the house belonged to more than a single family's ambition. In the end, the revenge was not savage. It was precise, legal, and honest. I had not tried to humiliate them publicly for sport. I had exposed their intent with evidence and let the truth do the rest. They were punished not with ruin, but with consequence. The community's withdrawal of naive support, the halting of their renovation dreams, and a new, uncomfortable awareness of what it means to treat another person as an asset. When the dust settled, my daughter sat alone in a kitchen she had planned to remake, staring at plaster she would not change. Her husband packed his tools with fingers that trembled, and in the quiet, I felt a mercy that surprised me. I had wanted them to learn. I had wanted them to understand the weight of what they'd tried to take. I had wanted dignity restored, not revenge that destroyed, but a balance returned. And balance returned, in its own slow, exacting way. The last twist was perhaps the kindest. In selling to a man who loved the house, I had ensured that the life we made there would be honored, not erased. That final act, the one they had thought would humiliate me, became the clearest statement of who I was. A man who would not be dismissed, who would not be quietly shoved into a corner, who would, with careful hands and steady resolve, protect the thing that proved his life had meaning. They had thought the story would end with them triumphant. Instead, it ended with the truth laid bare, with justice that wore no malice, and with a lesson that would live longer than any renovation or glossy floor. When the storm finally quieted, I found myself in a silence I hadn't known in years. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, but of a man who had spoken his last necessary word. The house was no longer mine. The deed had passed, the ink had dried, and the keys sat in the hands of someone who valued them. And yet, as I stood in the little cottage by the lake where I had moved, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: lightness. The first few mornings I woke with the habit of waiting for footsteps, my daughter's voice, the husband's arrogance. But there were no footsteps, just birds, water lapping, and the gentle creak of the porch boards under my chair. At first, the quiet hurt. It reminded me of what I had lost. Not the house, but the daughter who had once held my hand as we crossed busy streets. I remembered her as a little girl, hair tangled, smile too big for her face. And I grieved that the woman she had become was a stranger, someone who could calculate my worth in square footage. But grief is a strange thing. It sharpens, then dulls. It leaves behind a scar you can trace with your fingers but no longer bleed from. I began to fill my days with small rituals. I brewed my coffee slowly, watching the steam curl like memory. I took walks along the lake path and greeted people who didn't know my story, who saw only an old man with a steady gait. Sometimes I even smiled back. Frank visited often. He brought newspapers, sometimes a bottle of whiskey, and we'd sit in the fading light, two old men sharing the weight of time. "You did the right thing," he'd say, though he never dressed it up in sentiment. And I'd nod, though a part of me always asked, was there another way? Could I have saved her from herself? The answer, I realized, was no. We can teach children to walk, to speak, to build, but we cannot teach them gratitude when their hearts are too full of hunger. That lesson life delivers itself, sometimes harshly, sometimes too late. Word of what had happened spread further than I expected. Neighbors who had once waved politely now sought me out, asking for advice, asking to hear the stories of the house. It seemed my small act of resistance had struck a chord, not because I was special, but because too many had felt what I felt, discarded, underestimated, quietly erased. I became, in a way, a warning, and perhaps also a reminder. My daughter did not visit for months. When she finally came, her face carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. But she did not speak them. She asked only, "Can we talk?" And I said yes, though I knew some wounds do not close. We walked by the lake. She cried more than she spoke. I listened, though I did not comfort the way I once did. Love remained, but trust, that had been buried with the house. Still, I left a space for her, not in my home, not in my deeds, but in my heart. Because revenge had never been about destroying her. It had been about reclaiming me. And in reclaiming myself, I found room for forgiveness, though never forgetfulness. The preservationist who bought the house kept his promise. Every now and then, he sent me a photograph. The porch lit at dusk, the garden blooming wild, the old beams shining with care. In those photographs I saw proof that my life's work was not lost, not dismantled, not sold for scraps. It lived on, sturdy, dignified, just as I had intended. There is a peace in knowing that, even when people betray you, the things you have built with honest hands can still endure. And there is a deeper peace in knowing you have the right to protect yourself, even from those you once loved most. As the seasons passed, I found myself no longer rehearsing old arguments in my mind. I did not replay the shouts, the slammed doors, the accusations. Instead, I remembered small joys, teaching her to ride a bike, patching up scraped knees, building a swing in the backyard. Those were mine, and nothing could take them away. But I also remembered the look on her face the night she realized the house was gone. The shock, the disbelief, the anger. That memory stood as both wound and warning, because sometimes it takes the collapse of a dream to wake someone up to the weight of their choices. I don't know if she will ever truly understand why I did what I did. I don't know if she will ever forgive me, but I have learned to live without needing her forgiveness. The only forgiveness I needed was my own, for waiting so long, for letting myself be treated as disposable, and I have given that forgiveness freely. Now, when people ask me what happened, I don't tell them a story of spite. I tell them a story of survival. I tell them that love without respect is just a leash. That sacrifice without gratitude becomes a chain, and that dignity is not something you beg for. It is something you protect, even if you stand alone. The moral is simple, though it took me a lifetime to learn. Never let anyone, not even your own blood, convince you that your worth is measured by what you can give them. Your worth is your own. And if you allow others to treat you as a burden, they will. But if you stand, if you claim your place with quiet strength, the world will remember you not as a relic, but as a man who chose dignity over despair. And so my story ends, not with a ruined house, nor with a ruined man. It ends with a truth that I hope outlives me. Blood may bind us, but respect sustains us. Without respect, even family can become strangers. With respect, even strangers can become family, and I would rather die respected by strangers than live erased by my own kin.